Hello everyone. First, the out of character announcement for those who are popping on and to give you a chance to get established. This is part of a massive live action role playing community. They've got a presence in most American cities and most major American cities and some of the small ones and many of the major Canadian cities. So if you're interested in participating and you have no idea what this is, I've included some useful links to the communities that you can sign up for or get more information for to become a part of this. The content of these broadcasts is going to contain some in-character information with an actual broadcast, and if you're up to shenanigans, that would be something where you're going to have to work with proxying and my VST and all that business as per the announcements by the NST staff of the United States. This is one of many broadcasts, which will be probably a weekly feature. I might stick with the Saturday day for now. We'll see how things like work schedules fix things. I know there's going to be a lot of you guys joining because these have gotten very popular in a very short amount of time. A lot of the time it's just going to be my character happily rambling. If you're interested in making a guest appearance, I won't be taking automatic pop-ups, but I am perfectly happy to have you message me and schedule something. That's including, say, if you're going to do a mediated effort to pop on to give your message, as well as just an everyday guest appearance. And I think that about covers it. When you see my hand over my head like this, it means out of character. That means that I'm not speaking as Cornelia Mawbury. Other than that, I'd like to say a huge thank you to a large number of people who made this possible, both through their encouragement, their willingness to play along, and also just the wild support and enthusiasm I've got for this project. I'm going to repeat a lot of this again at the end to make life easier for the NSTs, but I'd also like to say I really appreciate everything that everyone has done. And if you're feeling like doing your own video, I really encourage you. When I'm done, this is going to get stuck up on YouTube where you're going to be able to see the archive of past videos. And if you have something you're making, I'll be happy to link to it as well and share it because more creative things is great and LARP is a team sport. And if you're shy and you don't know what to say, don't worry about it. It's just like going to a live LARP. You just go there and you do it and you act. Okay, enough out of character rambling from me. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. It looks like my Christmas speech was popular enough that I've been asked to try making this a regular feature. Now, if you've known me over the last 317 years or so, you would know that prior to becoming Prince of Montreal, I was the well-known harpy, jet-setting all over the place to reconcile bone records. And for that, I'm known as social nobility in the Camarilla. Now, if you're watching this from a secured network. Obviously, you know that if you're part of the unique little club that we're part of, this is perfectly legitimate. And if you're not, this is just a fun story. Now, accessing this through the secured media, as long as you're part of the accepted guest list, is perfectly normal and okay. Copying this broadcast outside of the server space, now helpfully donated by my clanmates in Nova. Although I would like to say a great thank you for Hollywood, the Harpy of Orange County, for getting everything started off, and her excellent work making sure that our local hacker collectives are wearing their white hats. So I'll be talking a little bit more about Nova and what they do later on in this broadcast, but it is strictly forbidden to copy this broadcast outside of its existing distribution channels. It means don't make copies of it, don't share this around. If it ends up in the wrong hands, you're liable, I'm not liable. Same as if you decided to go out there and film me. Keep that in mind if you're getting any creative ideas about bringing this to show. If you have a login key, that means that somebody shared it with you. And my Loyal, life-sworn vassal Alan will be maintaining communications if you have something you need to tell me, since I happen to be an elder and you might be feeling it wouldn't be appropriate, let's say if you were a neonate, to talk to me, that you might want to see about contacting Alan and he'll be able to hook up any sort of connection that was necessary. Anyway, the question I got asked about, and this is a very important one, is why lying is the only moral choice for a kindred. And the answer to why lying is a moral choice is both very simple and a little bit complicated. So I'm going to have to go a little bit into kindred history, and I'm going to have to talk about a few things that make people very uncomfortable. But unfortunately, when you are an immortal being that feeds on the blood of the kind, there are certain compromises you may have historically been party to. And the first framing point that you must be aware of when you're dealing with the issue of the truth is to understand that what is considered to be good and moral is not a fixed point. The morality that we have is one part pragmatism and one part the ideals and knowledge of the environment. For example, in Canada, the kind do not approve of the death penalty. They're very strongly pro-controlling the access to firearms, although plenty of kind do enjoy firearms as part of a recreational experience, but there's a much less strong focus on the idea of, for example, protecting your property with the use of lethal force. If you're talking to someone in the United States, they find this completely incomprehensible. How could they possibly allow someone to steal their car if they have a handgun in the glove compartment? So this gives you an example of even how two populations that are very similar can have two very different ideas of what's morally appropriate. For a Canadian, and this is not every single Canadian, but this is behavior you might find throughout the entire country, it's much more normal to consider that the value of your personal property and your sense of safety, as far as someone being able to take it from you, is not worth someone's life, even if you know that they happen to be robbing you. Whereas in the United States, it's considerably more normal to consider it perfectly reasonable that if someone is attempting to liberate you of your things, to perforate them. In Canada, it's considered to be more reasonable to do that if you're in fear of imminent harm, and the kind are strongly encouraged to attempt to escape instead of to go to great lengths to fight. Now, this segues into talking about our little problem. We're immortal. We don't usually live forever. The average lifespan of a kindred is about 15 years. Most kindred do not make it into elder status, which is about 300 years, unless you've got an unusually socially savvy kindred who manages to get sponsorship into elderdom a little bit sooner. And that's something worth noting in the Camarilla. You don't just become an elder just because you're old or because your blood is potent. In order to become an elder, you have to have been present in our society for a certain amount of time and be recognized by the other elders of the Camarilla. Usually, it's a matter of established merit among many things. This is, of course, very complicated, but this is one of the ways that you have persons who aren't necessarily of the most potent blood become an elder. The trick with people who are 300 years or older is the things that you took for granted when you were alive aren't necessarily the most appropriate thing to do. You'll see this when you're reading old books. There'll be things that are incredibly racist. Wow! Well, when you've been alive for a long time, you don't just get to deal with generation after generation having its own little dark issues and things that you need to relax. You also have an issue that you have problems that you participated in because of the presence of the moment that never go away. For example, if you're immortal, not only did you necessarily come from a period when the concept of things like the death penalty or the use of torture was considered to be not just moral, but required for the edification of other persons. You then end up interacting with, say, someone who's been 15 years a kindred, trying to understand why you grew up watching people be broken on the wheel in the village square, and they grew up with the idea of rehabilitative justice. This can lead to a lot of complexities when you're attempting to establish a society, and much of the Camarilla is built on compromise. The other thing that's a very key part of kindred society, and this is the case with no matter what you are, this is the case if you're part of the Camarilla or if you're part of the Anarch Society, is the appropriate narrative of the truth. Now, citizens of the United States and kindred that come from the United States are absurdly and unusually attached to the concept of free speech. Most other countries don't value free speech to the same degree and offer to one degree or another limited free speech. If you only ever experience the United States, and you're not very old, you at least understand the concept of there being controls of speech you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to go up to someone and say, "I'm going to kill you." And you're not allowed to announce speech that would cause imminent harm to everyone. For example, causing a mass panic, in the example they give, a crowded movie theater where you shout, "Fire!" and everyone goes running. Those things, even in the United States, they tend to consider a bad idea. Now, when you're dealing with the behaviors of people who've been around for thousands of years, you've had people who've been participating in conflicts and wars and interactions and trying to protect people and trying to exterminate people, and you've had moral compromises that you've needed to make at the time based on what you have available. For example, if you look at the use of the death penalty, there are things that we used to put people to death for that seem absolutely absurd today. For example, the idea of being hung by the neck until you're dead for stealing a loaf of bread? That sounds horrible. Well, the reality is that for much of the history of the kind, justice was largely a matter of what your local magistrate was dealing out with the best knowledge that they had, usually their best case judgment, and there were a lot of things that seemed very innocuous but would actually get people killed. You say stealing a loaf of bread right now would mean, well, your local grocery store would be down one loaf that they wouldn't even notice, and they're probably throwing away dozens of loaves of bread every day. In a properly managed city, all that leftover food is collected up and redistributed amongst the homeless. And even if you happen to think that it's not a good idea, just keep in mind that a well-fed population has a stronger blood supply. Anyway, the point remains that the pragmatism of putting someone to death for small crimes like theft is connected to two factors. First of all, you would have your severity of the crime based on what you'd have at the era. When you steal a loaf of bread right now, it's just a loaf of bread. They come in plastic bags. They're pre-sliced. I can't imagine what they taste like. I remember what bread was like when I was alive. It was very flavorful, but it was full of little rocks. These days, bread looks like it's a sponge, and you can crush it down to nothing like that. Now, of course, I mostly ended up eating the finest white bread. I'm very lucky I have any teeth. But the point being is that when you stole a loaf of bread in many years past, that meant that you could actually be condemning someone to starve to death or be severely negatively affected because of the food scarcity involved. The other reality is the harshness of the punishment is the nature of what resources you have to deal with it. It may seem abominable to put someone to death, but the reality historically is the concept of a prison where you're sustaining someone in perpetual captivity is a very recent invention. It costs a lot of money to feed people and look after them, clothe them. And a modern prison takes care of most people's basic needs. It does so very poorly and horrifically, and often with a certain degree of coerced labor involved. Indeed, the United States is known for a massive prison industrial complex where, amongst many things, much of the paint in the United States is manufactured. This would essentially be being manufactured by slaves, although that's another tricky moral question. On the one hand, if you don't offer prisoners in prison the offer of meaningful labor, this tends to have a deleterious effect on their mental health. But if you do offer that availability, you significantly undercut the labor market by having a subsidized population of people who can't really consent to labor because you're in a position to significantly reduce the quality of their life if they don't cooperate with your particular economic model. So there's been many criticisms of the American prison system that it was in many areas an extension of slavery, creating a new opportunity to provide free labor when it was no longer legal to own a person under chattel slavery. Now, the thing about even debtor's prison is that debtor's prison would often require you to pay for it. Other opportunities for justice, such that we used to practice it, included things like transportation for life and contracts of indenture. And again, transportation for life would usually involve the cost of shipping you across the Atlantic, or later on, they'd be shipping you to Australia too. Good girl. You're a very good girl. We're not going to ship you to Australia. Anyway, the point being that we had all these things as an alternative solution because we didn't live in societies rich enough to provide that sort of care. Similarly, when you're a kindred, you don't really have many options to deal with someone who's misbehaving. The elaborate nature of our status system is what you'd call a carrot and a stick. That gives us an option to be kind and reward you, and it gives you an option to punish. And a lot of the social penalties that you might undergo involve reduced access to resources and reduced access to services. When you're warned, you don't get as much access to the court officials, which means that you have less access to care. And you're considered a person of reduced social worth. But kindred society tends to end up using the death penalty because we don't really have a good solution for problems that won't go away. Yes, Madame Tonnerre has an excellent point mentioning that in the United States, there is a massive issue with for-profit prisons. I recommend that if you're a Ventru and you're making some money through this, it's worth disinvesting. There's a lot of money in it, but on the other hand, it's very destructive to your humanity. I know that some of you had gone into slavery, seeing that, well, it's a model of owning land, and it was what the Romans did. And that's another point. Some of the most moral elders you knew were slave-owning society members, particularly the people who came from whatever their equivalent of an aristocracy was. Myself, as a countess, I profited considerably from great social inequality. There were essentially still serfs that were laboring on the lands in the county that my earl was in charge of. So you can see there are all these things in the past that just happen to exist that if you are raised with a good standard of living and you're born in the last 30 or so years, there's a lot of things you don't have to deal with. You have an increased quantity of opportunities, though not so much in the United States. Unfortunately, one of the side effects of the general creep, and this was made significantly worse by that number that the Giovanni did on the economic system, was that there's reduced social mobility. But the point being that the quality of life that you have if you were born in the last 30 years is considerably better than the quality of life you had if you were born in the last 300 years. Even allowing for someone like me, a privileged aristocrat who enjoyed every pleasure and had several hundred people whose job it was to make me happy and look after me. Well, even so, there were things that I didn't have access to that simply hadn't been invented yet. I know I really would have appreciated if there'd been some of the modern painkillers available, or antibiotics, or dental care. I got very lucky with my teeth. If you're ever in a good relationship with a very old kindred, there's a lot of little tells you can use to figure out someone's age. One of them is to look at how many teeth they have. Jimmy Kincaid, if you don't stop calling me on this network, you will regret it. The point being that, hold on one moment. have a Nosferatu spy master, and he's absolutely brilliant. He's one of the most connected Nosferatus in North America, and wouldn't really be fair to say he's my spy master. It's just that if you need to know what's going on, Jimmy Kincaid is one of the people who can get you connected to the right people to get you information. But sometimes he needs to understand that if it's not on fire, you don't need to use my direct line. He's an Ancilla, so that's perfectly reasonable, and he carries my favor. He carries a lot of people's favor. Anyway, where was it? I was talking about the reality of morality. Anyway, there's some lapse between the necessary compromises to maintain the masquerade and the necessary compromises that the average kind goes through. Now, the average kind's biggest moral concerns are a private prison industrial complex, or perhaps some issues with the fact that much of the manufacturing of the worldly goods that they use involve third world sweatshop labor. In another film, I'll talk a little bit about modern garment manufacturing and the evolution of textiles and how it went from being literal cottage industries to what it is today. But that would be getting beyond the point, which I need to talk about, which is lying. Kindred society is founded in modern day on a gigantic lie. We go out of our way to make sure that the kind are not aware that we exist in any meaningful way. This is a fairly fluid concept based on the fact that when you are alive, unless you're extremely old, I find it very dubious that your first answer to something being peculiar or unusual was, "Goodness me, they're immortal beings that control every layer of my government with insidious influence. Clearly it must be those creatures that dine on the blood who are responsible for me to see shimmering lights." So we're protected somewhat by the fact that it seems very improbable that we're real. I got asked by a certain luminary elder Kensington if the Ventru owned the prison industrial complex. And the answer is that kindred wealth comes from a variety of sources, and most Ventru have diversified portfolios. So it's quite possible that there are Ventru who specifically own the private prison industrial complex in the United States, but it's also equally plausible that it could be any clan. And there is no such thing as one clan that is a moral leader above other clans. There are clans that historically have certain talents. Being a Ventru comes with certain benefits that I can expound on at length. We have a warm, supportive society built around the idea of educating and taking responsibility for your children, which rewards public service, particularly in leadership positions, and the acquisition of influence. Now, other kindred societies built around the clans develop different things. For example, the Toreador have a monopoly on artistic ideas, but this often means that they're on the forefront of innovation. Good girl, Brioche, that's right. Mama needs to finish her broadcast. You be a good girl, okay? Anyway, on the subject of morality, even allowing for the fact that you want to be a good and moral person, the most idealistic anarch lives in a world where they wake up every evening and then they lie to approximately 8 billion people about their existence. And they do so via an elaborate system of contacts and control and surveillance, the scope of which seems very improbable when you talk about it. So there is a good reason to have a masquerade in place. The first reason they talk about the masquerade is that while any individual kindred has no problem dealing with any individual kind unless they're, shall we say, unusually potent in some supernatural fashion. On the other hand, large quantities of kind can be very hazardous to any kindred's health. That's the lesson that was learned during the Inquisition, when an absurd quantity of the kind became aware that there were certain presents that they wished to eliminate. Now, most of you do not wish to be murdered in your day's sleep, and most of you feel that you do the best you can with what you have available. I would imagine that accepting a few unusual pathbound individuals, you try to do the right thing wherever it's possible, if just to prevent your beast from consuming you, even if you know that compromise has been necessary to survive. But there's another reason for a masquerade that we don't necessarily talk about, and that is because of the awkward alternative issue of our relationship to the kind. So, one thing that you will know if you are very old, and I know this because I know very old people. I'm only 317 years old, and I would never put on airs about how much that grants me, and I'm certainly no academic scholar. But if you look far enough back into the history of the various clans, you'll start seeing some names that are very familiar. I was talking to some gangrel, and they mentioned the name Odin. On the other hand, if you look into my lineage, there is Tenia, and she was the mother of my grandfather. That is to say, Tenia's sire, Julia Antasia. But Tenia, in her time, was worshipped as a goddess. Now, this might leave you very cynical. If the gods themselves turned out to be kindred, then what is worth believing in? Or it might leave you focusing on the more modern monotheistic Yahweh concept, or Islam, or the modern interpretations of Judaism. And all these are perfectly valid outlets and expressions of faith. The matter to consider, however, is that we know that true faith in these individuals who we knew were kindred, and we can guarantee that Odin, well, maybe he was just borrowing the name and taking advantage of the recognition, but these religions definitely grew up additionally around the idea of these corporeal beings, and if you look at most pagan religions, they believe in the concept of corporeal gods who just happen to live elsewhere. In modern Victorian times, as we started mapping out the known world, they came up with the concept of the veil between the worlds, and this gets passed around as being something that's always been there. But we know better that supernatural beings don't necessarily live in an alternative plane. They tend to live next door, just in a place where you wouldn't necessarily notice them. The veil between the worlds is, however, a convenient little myth. Now, I got a little piece of information from a master elder of the Ravnos clan. He said, "Kindred kind exists within the fabric of the waking dream. It is only natural that the dreamers create systems wherein they are lucid in order to attempt to reassure themselves that the world they know is somehow concrete rather than abstract." Now, I don't know about that. That's getting a little complicated for me. But the point about divinity is that for all that we know that all these people running around were not gods in any sense that we think in the modern term, and we know that they had houses and lives and jobs and families. And if you look at the practice of paganry, for example, even within my family, my grandfather still maintains his Druidic beliefs to this day. He still has a valid faith. He still has his oracular gift and occasionally comes out with pieces of rather disturbing truth. Faith in the old gods still seems to be perfectly applicable and provide all the comforts that faith in modern religion does. It follows thus that the logical consequence of living amongst the kind as if we were not required to distance ourselves is that it's almost automatic that we ended up in a position of being gods. And if not necessarily in a position of being gods, we end up in a position of being aristocrats and rulers. Now, as a Ventrue, this might seem very controversial for me to be talking about. Why wouldn't a Ventrue talk about how natural it is to end up ruling? But I'd like to consider the argument of looking at the anarch movement. Now, if you do a quick little study of the people who are holding presidential seats, there are not a lot of anarch elders, but a disproportionate number of the anarch elders hold some position of responsibility. The oldest kindred in Montreal, he's about 1,000 years old and a bit, is the duly elected president. The Advocate of New York is an elder. And this is something that I've noticed myself for being an elder, is that it's natural and very easy for me to rise to positions of authority and power. even if I don't use any of my powers of the blood, and I very seldom need to. If I chose to activate the level of presence that I'm capable of, I'd turn the average neonate's brain into pudding, and literally no kind who is not blessed with some god or some magical gift can resist me, as is a common blessing of our clan. This presents a small detail that provides complexity. If I'm dealing with the kind on a one-to-one basis and they have no buffer of protection caused by the masquerade, this means that I am sailing through the streets at night, being the most beautiful, glamorous, and wonderful creature that they have. I become a living goddess. And this might seem like an addictive prospect, or it might seem like a prospect that you'd resist. Oh no, I'd never be a brutal goddess. I would end up being a benevolent ruler. I would only seek to improve their lives. The problem with that issue, and that has happened every single time that the kindred have ever set out to build this sort of utopia where they will just provide some guidance and leadership, because we do end up with fairly intelligent kindred, or ones who are very experienced with leadership, is that whenever we end up in this position, we end up with our priorities necessarily determining the behavior of the kind. The more the masquerade took hold, and the more the Camarilla spread out, the freer the kind became. Now, this again may seem controversial, but it's worth noting that as we went through the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance, you see renewed communication, renewed exploration, renewed ability to experience knowledge and expand on what human possibilities were. The Renaissance was followed by the Enlightenment, from the Enlightenment to things considerably more modern. And moral things based on the elevation of want were possible that were simply not a reality for anyone who was living in a mud hovel on the side of what they dared to call a castle, but would be closer to be a pile of rocks. Keep that in mind, that the greatest kings of 1,000 years ago ruled over populations smaller than most modern cities, and indeed smaller than many modern small cities. The net result being that if you are seeking to deal with the kind, one of the best things you can do is to go hands-off as possible. Now, everyone has their little hobby manipulations. For example, in the city of Montreal, a Mr. Walker of the Daughters of Cacophony has started organizing safe injection sites. It's of particular interest to him, I think because of in mortal times, he was a user of various opiates and injectables. I'm not sure of the precise details of how he was fixed with the habit, but it's left him with a personal concern in that subject. Myself, I like to alleviate the suffering caused by certain institutional forces. I've been particularly active in seeking justice for people who've survived the residential schools, and I donated heavily to survivors of the Magdalene laundries. But in any case, the net result has been an era of unprecedented freedom where the kind have been free to live with benefits that were previously only possible to be enjoyed by a kindred. For example, we see an increased quantity of female leaders. Well, the princess of a city may identify as any gender or none. The reality that the mayor of a city might be female is something that only just happened in Montreal this year. And this particular sort of achievement is only possible because of the progress we've made. This means that the most moral thing you can do is maintain the lie of the masquerade. If you care about the kind, in order to prevent yourself from being in a position where you end up putting your fingers into their day-to-day life, you need to take a step back. And the other reason why you need to take a step back is that if the kind have to fight you directly, they're going to do this via hunters. And if they do this via hunters, this encourages a certain sort of fanatical religiosity, which discourages other forms of progress. Research, the investment into the well-being of the kind. All these things fall by the wayside as you create a grim era where all knowledge ceases. and people close down. I fear an end of the masquerade, not because I fear it would be the end of our kind. Our kind will be fine. Persons like myself are so blessed that we would probably find a way. I mean, perhaps I myself might be murdered by a mob, but there are many others with equal blessings as myself who come across as lovely and perfectly harmless. It would be unkind to members of society like the Nosferatu, who would face a steep social penalty. For them, the masquerade offers many more benefits. But the reason for the masquerade is because it protects the kind from us as much as it protects us from the kind. And the reality of a society without the masquerade would not be one where we would walk amongst them sharing our knowledge of the ages. It would be one where the only realistic response of the kind would be to unite together under the most vicious and autocratic religious leaders in order to be able to combat us, because it would be the only weapon they had. This way, we have a compromise. This is where it's going to get a little bit more complicated, because I'm going to talk about why you need to have a slightly more relaxed relationship with the truth if you happen to be a kindred. So there are things that kindred have done historically that are horrifying and regrettable. Some of them have happened in very recent history. We had our caitiff purges, which, well, I know they're fixed with a terrible disability, and it's very unfortunate. There are many who don't survive the first few days of their embrace because of the nature of the disability they're fixed with. And to be honest, any caitiff you meet is the product of a disgusting crime. Caitiff are birthed when a member of their bloodline, somewhere in the history of that lineage, has committed the sin of diablerie. Now, it's not the individual caitiff's fault. They carry the punishment of a decision that may have been made generations ago. So it's no wonder that people will go after the caitiff over that. Particular to that, it's also understandable. There were all these prophecies that the end of the world was going to come if there was a plethora of caitiff. And the answer was not that the caitiff were going to cause the end of the world. Expecting caitiff to do anything like that, the poor sterile things, well, commonly found in the scourge position, because that's all that they usually can handle. Poor, poor things. Some of them can be very articulate and well constructed. They can be very surprising. They usually don't lead very long lives, and they have many disabilities. But the point being is that the people who read those as prophecies got it back to front. That was a warning that if you didn't maintain certain moral behaviors and engaged in power-seeking behaviors, you would doom society. The increased number of caitiff being produced is not a symptom of the fact that caitiff are magical and will cause society to fall apart. That is absolute nonsense. The reason why you don't want to have a lot of caitiff being produced is that means that the generations prior to the caitiff have been absolutely abominable, and some of them may not supposed to be going into any Elysium. So you have to admit that certain terrible things did happen, but you also have to deal with the fact that kindred society has existed for so long and been involved in so many different wars that, as I said, anyone who hasn't been embraced in the last couple of years has been involved in at least one complicated conflict based on some sort of ideological point that was incredibly relevant at the time. And one of the side effects of not continuing this conflict is often shutting down certain aspects of it and closing off certain avenues of it. You also have to deal with the fact that what you may have believed at the time turned out not to be correct. For example, when I was alive, they used all sorts of purgatives as treatments for medical problems. These days, the idea of administering poisons to people seems like a horrible idea. On the other hand, can you imagine trying to explain the concept of chemotherapy to someone? We give you a poison that almost kills you and renders you sterile, or with horrible birth defects, causes all your hair to fall out, and this will somehow cure your cancer? So you end up with all these little things which seem very horrible at the time. And when we finally get around to getting a proper cure for cancer that's not quite as invasive, and we will solve the problem eventually, it's going to seem like chemotherapy was like back when you'd get a badly broken limb and they just hack the whole thing off and dip it in pitch. which at the time was the only sensible answer. Likewise, with modern antibiotics, what would be a tiny little scratch is no longer the possible infection that causes your entire face to rot off. These days, they just give you a little shot of something and you're ready to go again and get back out there. But if you're a member of kindred society and you've been participating in it for a long time, essentially every single clan has a bone to pick with every other clan, and every other lineage has had some reason to interact in their past negatively with someone else, and they often did this with the best will in the world. We know that adaptation and change is possible. For example, the current situation with the viziers being admitted into the Camarilla. We had long despaired and looked to the entire Assamite clan as being a hopeless group of diablerists not to be trusted. The idea that anything they could be providing would be perfectly reasonable seemed abominable, and the only people that you'd interact with were the rare, strange few who'd crept away and found a place in the Camarilla or amongst the anarch movement. And the reality is, when they came over en masse, they just turned out to be people like you and me, and they turned out to be people with valuable skills. They make among many of the princes. They fill out many courts. They're valuable members of local anarch movements. So the whole idea of disliking the Assamites ends up creating an environment where you're carrying this prejudice forward because it's been simplified based on the fact that you've been in conflict with it. Now, I wouldn't be able to tell you the entirety of the information of the history of the Assamites. I'd have to ask an Assamite and trust them to provide accurate information. So maybe the Prince of Boston or the Prince of New York would be better off speaking for themselves. But it's one of those situations where it's possible for people to let go of beliefs, but it's not possible for everyone to let go of grudges. So if you're a human, you exist with the concept of living memory. This is an event that has occurred during a period when it's possible to find someone who at least remembers someone who talked to someone who was around there when it happened. When an event falls out of living memory, it falls entirely into the presence of myth. That means that the only proof that you have that it existed was some artifacts, maybe some images, all things where you can't go and talk to someone about it, and then it becomes a story. It becomes a narrative that you tell, and the narratives that you prioritize out of the various things that you could talk about in the past and how you talk about the past is going to be influenced by what you think of in the present. One of the most hilarious things ever is to take historical movies and television shows and show them to elders who are not archaic enough that they find that looking at the blurry visions are uncomfortable and asking them what they think of the costuming. And you'll see them hooting and falling over because of the way that they do everything. It'll always be in the style and the value of the time. For example, when women's rights became more popular during the progressive period in the Victorian era, and that's prior to when women's suffrage came through. This was just when they gained more custodial rights and more protections in marriage. The play that suddenly became very popular was a translation of the classical Greek play Medea. I remember watching Medea at my box office seats, enjoying it, and that's a story about a woman who was so misused by her husband that the only appropriate choice, according to her, was to murder her children and serve them to her husband to eat. Now, this doesn't necessarily go down well with a modern audience. That just seems like absurd, crazy behavior. But to a Victorian who'd suddenly rediscovered the possibility that you could restructure their family environment such that women were considerably less treated like property, a story about the rage of a vulnerable person ended up providing a useful medium by which you could talk about the problems of the modern era. Another thing that people keep showing me, they're talking about, it's just like Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones. They talk about Game of Thrones as being historical, but Game of Thrones is ridiculous. For example, all the women have long, flowing hair and pretty braids. How are they keeping that clean? That's horrifying. Do you know how we kept it clean when we didn't have regular access to boiling water? We wrapped everything up in clean linen clothing, because if you couldn't wash yourself, and if you realized how common drowning was in the era I was alive, and even straight up until the previous century, how little access you had to safe potable water, wrapping yourself in clean linen or other vegetable fiber cloths and changing these on a regular basis allowed you to maintain a certain measure of hygiene. So seeing all these women who are ostensibly supposed to be running around, and I think it's supposed to be 12th century maybe? Well, some sort of knockabout fantasy 12th century, without these coverings and cloths is absolutely filthy. Never mind the fact that they decided to pack every single atrocity that had ever happened during the Protestant Reformation and crammed it into a couple of years of a series, or their absolutely absurd fixation with certain kinds of war crime. I will consider the show much more credible when they start depicting the assault of men with the same way that they depict the assault of women. Have you ever been after a battle where it's been a full-on massacre? It's not the cosmetic use of the violation of women's bodies as decoration. It's the horrible mistreatment of the various male captives as well. But this always gets glossed over, even though, for example, at the end of that Bosnia conflict, they did a survey of the survivors and found out that the majority of the male survivors had gone through a sexual assault as a result of their victimization. But this is what I mean about the lens of how we see the past is supposed to be, is not the same as the way the past actually was. So even when we have reliable information, the kind have the advantage of living memory that they can push things out of the way. This allows you to release things that were absolutely important to your ancestors, but would be incredibly traumatic to deal with. For example, if you look at most family trees, you'll find one or two people who committed murder, just if you run the odds enough back, or participated in some sort of horrible racist political belief. Or as another example, if you roll your family tree back far enough, and this goes for you young uns out there, take a look at your family tree, push it back far enough, and you're going to find somebody who got married to a 13 or a 14-year-old and had kids within a period that suggested it was not just a convenience marriage. That sort of behavior these days we know to be appalling. You don't do those things to children. I mean, even in the time when I was alive, the attitude that, again, certain historical media has of treating child marriages like it's normal and like they were routinely consummated is, again, historically inaccurate. These were actually in the minority. For example, they'll talk about how getting married at 17 was normal and you'd be married off as a teenager, but amongst the Victorian period, the average age of marriage would have been in your mid-20s because starting a household was expensive. Anyway, the point being is that we maintain this control over the truth because if we don't have a coherent narrative, we end up with an environment where you never get to let anything go. One of the most excruciating things you can deal with is a kindred who's hung up on an atrocity that happened in a city that nobody remembered. And you can tell them over and over again, yes, it was valid. It was terrible this happened to you. I'm sorry your family was murdered. That trauma was awful. I'm here for you. I'll listen for you. But then this trauma gets paid forward and it starts motivating actual murders in the modern day, which creates a further cascade of trauma. A lot of the conflict that takes place between the Bruja and the Ventru is not based on any sort of modern day reason to dislike each other. The reality is that we usually end up getting along very well if you put us together. The challenge instead is that if you don't have the means to let things go, they continue to snowball and create night after night and after night after night of additional conflict. So this sort of lying, where you don't necessarily say things that you know to be true, is also an act of protection. The selective use of the truth this way can seem horrifying, but if you think of it this way, if you have a severely traumatized person who's inflicting generational trauma on another generation, who's inflicting it on another generation, you at least have the advantage that eventually they'll die of old age and they'll stop being the voice that conveys things forward. Similarly, when you're doing academic research, I had it explained to me that as you get a generation that dies off, you release a new quantity of information. We don't have that advantage as kindred. And as much as the young people tend to talk about, yes, that would be wonderful, we wouldn't have to deal with the older people anymore, again, it has the problem that that's not how our society works, and this era's callow youths, as I find myself, 17 years after debuting as an elder, I become tonight's elder. So the point is established that you should think of it this way. In the Camarilla, we have a status called honorable. An honorable person is immune to being accused of being a liar unless you expend the appropriate status, or if you're in possession of certain statuses. Now you might wonder about that. Why do we call them honorable and not honest? Here is why. When we call someone honorable, we mean that we trust them to maintain the narrative of our society. If we meant that they were honest, we would call them honest. Most kindred have an excellent grasp of language. They're often multilingual as a side effect of having to pick them up from your environment. A monolingual kindred who's more than 50 years old is actually quite the curiosity. Pour moi, je parle français, et aussi je parle Latin. Now, I have my French that I picked up as a practical language, and I have my Latin that I picked up as part of my agoge. But again, that's beside the point. We have the status of honorable, not honest, because the control over this narrative is how we cause a society not to devolve down into these endless blood feuds where people are killing each other over the fact that somebody's sire back in the 6th century was promised a land claim and got into a duel with someone else, but we didn't like the way it was set up, or somebody had a massive conflict with their family that turned into the elimination of a huge part of their family, and now they have to deal with the realities of a genocide that they can never get away from. Sometimes we're lucky, and with the caitiff purges, we can acknowledge the mistake and why they made a mistake. Exactly. Can't go around telling every kindred mortal you meet you're a vampire. But the control of the truth and your use of the selective way you convey information is an essential part of how you control and protect the other members of your society. Occasionally, it becomes possible to have information revealed. For example, for much of our history, we maintained that the founders were not real. Now, anyone who did the lineage math, just counting back their lineages like a Ventru, would simply say, of the Ventru, and that was that. And the reality is that we knew we had to come from somewhere, but it was understood within our society that we didn't poke further than that. And it's for the same reason that we don't allow the kind to go burrowing their way into our society. But this level of distance is a good thing. Now, we all know that the founders are loving mothers and fathers, and as loving mothers and fathers, much how we give the kind distance if we actually care about the protection of the kind and don't bury ourselves in their houses. And there's something horrible and disgusting about people who try to go about living a normal mortal life as if nothing had ever happened. Likewise, I know that my clan was founded by a first person. We refer to them as Ventru. We're not even sure if Ventru was their name because they've been less evident than others, but I can reason that I know that they love us, for if they didn't, being of that level of power would simply be able to remove me. But much as the Prince of Montreal does not go into the lowliest home of her subjects and start ordering them around by all her authority, I know that my loving mothers and fathers do not necessarily need to go into my environment. They take a step back to allow us to flourish and grow. I imagine that their role in the creation of the Camarilla may have been to give us some freedom to experience something that we'd never had before. I didn't experience this myself, but very old kindred tell me that In ages past, it was much more likely to see the ties of your lineage be ties of blood bonds, and to have these interlocking families, where this was considered to be perfectly moral and perfectly natural. Even 317 years ago, the concept of being fully bound to one's sire was considerably less a matter of a loss of liberty, and was considered to be something much more comfortable. And it's unsurprising that as much as there's a great talk of elders oppressing people, the majority of people who are carrying partial or full blood bonds are actually elders. You're a good girl. Good girl. And it's one of those peculiarities that obviously there's room for exploitation in any political system. But the Camarilla offers one of the most liberal and free societies that it is possible for a group of people who are possessed by some sort of blood-seeking demon that powers their immortality and allows them to maintain a capacity far, far, far beyond anything that any normal kind would hope to achieve. Goodness only knows, for example, when I was alive, I was considered to be quite the beauty. I'm not saying this with a trace of bragging. I'm saying that I was specifically selected because I was a comely young lady with lovely features. But the level of beauty that I'm perceived with in these nights is a matter of a supernatural potency of the blood. And by that it follows that this maintenance of the truth as a narrative, as opposed to the truth as something that you just should let free and everyone should know everyone's business. Any information should be passed around, and that is something that everyone considers as wonderful until the day that a photograph of you not wearing any clothing starts being passed around, and suddenly you understand why some things need to be private and some things are none of anyone's business. I got asked as an aside, why would you embrace a person who is not attractive? And the answer is that there are plenty of reasons why you would embrace a person who is not attractive. They had other skills available that were valuable. Now, Ventru tend to be chosen for our social abilities, as well as the strength of our minds, which means that you have quite a few of us who are possessing of some trait or another, that we are either lovely or manipulative, or sometimes both, just as a matter of what works best with our blood. But, for example, it's quite normal to find a beautiful Toreador, or a beautiful Bruja, or a beautiful Lasombra, or even a beautiful Setite. But nobody needs a beautiful Nosferatu. They might have been beautiful in life, and they might have been doing some sort of peculiar lesson teaching about the non-necessity of the flesh. But there are many reasons why you might embrace someone. They might be such a fascinating person, even though that they're some sort of ugly, that you want to keep them around forever. And another broadcast, I'm going to teach you about the nature of beauty and how this is a construct that you can learn to control and possess yourself, and that you shouldn't feel that beauty is something that I am gifted by some god, but rather it is a learned skill based on existing talents that I have utilized and that I am freely willing to make available to everyone else. I'll even show you a little bit of how I do my makeup. The point being is that if you're not telling lies, you're putting people in danger. And we leave a lot of room for lies in our society as well, because of the absolute and brutal nature of some of our laws, and they have to be to make allowances for the things that are necessary to do. We also need to have leeway to allow for mercy. Now, as a prince, I'm a fairly absolute monarch, as long as none of the traditions are violated, and to be honest, as long as the masquerade is not violated, boons are followed, status is respected, there is a lot of leeway that I can have. But as a result of this, the officers of my court are equipped to deal with certain things. and one of them is to have a certain degree of discretion with how much information they give me. Now, I wouldn't be very happy if they're violating my trust, but on the other hand, I understand that there are certain things that are necessary for them to have their own personal purview of and control the information of. For example, my sheriff is responsible for security. Someone appears to be shouting. Please do hold on one moment. Well, that was a little awkward. Unfortunately, in an effort to try to pause the broadcast, because it doesn't have a pause button, it's kind of frustrating. You'd think it would. We ended up knocking the whole thing offline. Hopefully you guys aren't all stuck on the other broadcast. Unfortunately, my brother and the player of my former Scourge forgot to text me that he was coming over and showed up to pick up his mail. Oops! Anyway, no harm done. Well, oh dear. Well, you probably caught the first half of the broadcast. Everything's all right, though. That was a quick little security check. Our former Scourge was testing something on the network and making sure that he caught a hunter potential who was going through. But we're back now, and it looks like it's all right. Get that adjusted. This time it wasn't Alan's fault. Not going to blame him for things that were not his responsibility. So we're going to have to figure out a way of seaming the two videos together, because it looks like we're going to have two copies. But I think that Alan managed to salvage the first video. It looked like we were going to lose it, but then we managed to get a copy that popped up again. So it should be possible to download the two copies. And then they will be posted in the online archive for your continued enjoyment. I think I made the point pretty succinctly about why the truth is a mutable subject that you must occasionally release for the protection of everyone. And also, you have to be very careful about what you believe to be the truth to be an idea that would percolate very slowly and often via our oral tradition. That's another issue. Kindred society has not always historically been literate. We've had a disproportionate number of individuals who have been literate, but the necessity of hiding our presence means that a surprising quantity of the information that we pass back and forth is not based on writing things down in any sort of coherent book about what it's like to be a kindred. Unfortunately, that's generally considered to be too risky. Instead, we end up with letters, which are very subjective, or we end up with people traveling back and forth to share opinions. Now, already, courts can become very fragmented, with a great deal of difference ranging from where you go. And this can mean that things that would feel like they're the objective truth can be very variable. For example, it's amazing the number of kindred who still believe that if an Elysium is violated, you need to literally burn it down and salt the earth that it stood on. There were elders who were arguing that with my Keeper of Elysium, that was the case in every single city. And you would think that they'd simply be able to take a short trip by car or train and find out that that wasn't the case. You do not need to burn down and salt a violated Elysium. Good gracious, what would happen if someone broke into your haven? Firebombing? Good girl, good girl. So the point holds that the truth necessarily has to be mutable, or we'd never let go of these issues that cause us to be in conflict with one another. Anyway, that was about all the philosophical things that I felt necessary to share. I'll probably have to do up a little essay summarizing them, but I feel like I'd be letting you down if I didn't give you a little news blurb. We're still doing ongoing investigations into the attack on the Elder Prince Amantis of San Francisco. He's supposed to release a statement later. And I'm happy to say that the primogen of his city, of my clan, and my cousin, Felicity, will be doing the head up of the investigation, and she's already made progress. As a result of information we've gained so far, it appears that it was the work of Hugo Duval through a Toreador agent that he sent after the Prince Amantis. I'm not going to speculate, because my guessing about something, again, that point about the truth, I tell you something, it passes into what everyone knows. Suddenly it is the knowledge that everyone says that they have. In this particular case, while the investigation is ongoing, not having control over the narrative means that the information that will be traveling from coast to coast means that goodness only knows what will happen. If you need to know what is going on, I can recommend that you contact the Seneschal of San Francisco as a reliable source of responsibility, or if you happen to be prestigious enough, you should contact and send your words of care and concern to Elder Prince Amantis. Now, he may not be available because, as we all know, there is a New Year's Eve rant happening tomorrow night, and we're going to ring in the new year with the new spirit of where the Bruja are going to be going with things. Now, I've been invited by Miss Karma, so I'll be attending as a guest, and for my next film, I'll be talking about a little bit more about the Bruja and how to conduct yourself appropriately at a rant. Now, for those of you who are currently in a state of abject fear that a Ventru has decided to travel into the company of a large quantity of Bruja, an environment known for beating people, oh, do calm down. They're perfectly civilized. You'd think that I decided to hand myself over to the Vandals, wearing naught but my shift. Elder Prince Sigrid runs one of the more stable cities in North America. I think she has this pretty well nailed down, and I think that I'm going to be absolutely fine. Things are relatively slow at the moment, with no major activity taking place over the last week since I did a news broadcast. We're still waiting on Prince Amantis's public statement that he's going to give. However, it does bring to our attention that something needs to be done about the most dangerous man in North America. Although we lost the Prince of Trenton, and the new Prince of Trenton, long may she reign, did not sustain the blood hunt in that city, my uncle, Prince Reichard of Los Angeles, has extended the blood hunt over Hugo Duval to properly respect how dangerous he is to kindred kind. It's also very worth noting that he has seemed to have a pattern of particularly attacking Ventru, so there's been some very suspicious attacks on Ventru recently that, again, don't go making guesses and suppositions, but we're going to be investigating this thoroughly to see if he might be the responsible party. Usually when he's responsible for something, he leaves a calling card. Hugo Duval is not known for his modesty. Being the most dangerous kindred in North America means that, and the most wanted outside of the red list, means that he will stop at nothing to make sure that if something happens, you know who's responsible. Goodness only knows where he's going to strike next. Now, that concludes the majority of the news I had, just a short little scraplet, and I'd like to repeat my thank yous. I'd like to repeat a particular thank you to House Nova. They put the Anarch in anarcho-capitalist and have had a particular interest in providing their own skills at security for hosting broadcasts. If you're interested in providing your own broadcast and wondering where to put it, you should reach out to House Nova as a possible sponsor. Now, as far as further participation in things, I'll be doing a guest appearance on Keeping Up with the Kensingtons, where Luminary Elder Kensington is going to ask, is scandal inevitable? And if so, what does it mean? The topic for next week's broadcast, as well as a little news bite to get you up to date with things, is going to be survival amongst the Bruja and their unique and valuable culture, and also a little bit about how you can see parallels of the Bruja's culture present in the Anarch movement. Much how the Camarilla shows influence of the Ventru and our particular systems, because we had a strong role in its design, the Bruja had a very strong role in the Anarch movement's design, with many founding and important Anarchs being of that clan. You're a good girl. So, on behalf of myself and Brioche, we wish you a Happy New Year, and hopefully we'll figure out a way of tacking this little piece onto the other video. So that concludes everything for tonight, and we'll be seeing you again soon. Don't forget, you can send your questions and comments along to Alan, who will be able to process them and provide you, where appropriate, with a response, or pass them along to me where appropriate. You all have a wonderful evening, and stay warm. Nothing sadder than a kindred who's frozen solid to the sidewalk, and there is an Arctic chill over the northeast. Maybe they're all getting ready for Luminary Elder Princess Sigrid's rant. As we know, she is the King of the North. Okay, so the bottom half of my broadcast got cut off due to being knocked offline, but that pretty much concludes everything. If you have any questions and comments, I love your feedback. I'm doing the out of character hand thing, which is not as obvious. If you want to create your own broadcast, please don't feel free. This is not my copyrighted thing. Making your own broadcast is not a unique habit that you have to not share. You should totally make it. I will link to it. I will share it. I love you. I love your broadcast. Go ahead and do it. And I have half a dozen people who are currently trying to message me with mundane things, so I'll go take care of that. You have a great night.